So moving well with someone has an aesthetic and ethical quality. I'm just going to read my abstract to begin with. When we engage well with someone else, be it to shake hands, dance, make music, or have a wonderful conversation, this foregrounds what we call relational qualities inherent in music, such as rhythm and pitch. So embodied rhythm may be essential for our survival as social beings and our well-being, as it allows us to co-adapt to each other, form trust, and experience difference without conflict. This is something I'm deeply interested in. Increasingly, the rhythms of our daily lives are affected by our use of various forms of social media technologies. I hear so many stories from parents about kids being hooked into these sort of, tablets and mobiles. And this adds to the complexity of how we make sense of each other in our homes, organisations, and urban environments. So I'm going to explore the relational quality of rhythm and how it enables us to manage social uncertainty and to tune with difference. So let's consider our face-to-face communications. How the meanings of words can sometimes get missed or misunderstood because a gesture may have become too loud, or a voice was too quiet, an intonation ungrasped, a movement mistimed. And we may ask, how do I know that I have understood and that I have been understood? These phatic or prosodic qualities may be said to shape how we make sense of each other. Someone whom I met briefly at Stanford spoke of her experience of ordering food in a restaurant in France while visiting with her husband. She's deaf, her husband is not, and he didn't speak French very well. He tried without much success to make himself understood to the waiter using his poor French, so she gave it a try. And using gestures and sounds, she was able to convey their needs with success. Her husband had attended to words, she had tuned to movements and sounds that would engage the waiter. And such improvisation isn't about a one best way, and nor is it possible to abstract it outside the persons involved in it. It is a personal act of knowing. The person becomes something quite important in the work that I do. So often we talk about individuals, we talk about users. But the person is a very complex being. We're all complex beings. I can be a sister, a daughter, a colleague. I can be simultaneously so many things. So that's a very important thing. What I'm going to explore is how sharing a physical space allows us to experience social uncertainty and enables us to manage it. And rhythm will emerge as an important aspect of this capacity. So imagine, you're standing in a field and another person enters it from the far side. Even though you cannot see the details of each other's faces or features, the moment you both become aware of each other's existence, you become co-present and you share that space. We naturally orient our bodies to express how we seek to connect with each other. There's an amazing scholar called Adam Kendon who's been doing lots of work on social interaction, how our bodies move and orient towards each other in space. And he describes how, if we stand in a circle and chat, or we stand at an angle, or we directly face each other, or we sit next to each other, shapes our presence and affects how we can make sense of each other. And this process, the processes of sense-making through body movements, gestures, vocal sounds, speech, and stillness, has been described by a delightful anthropologist who's now no longer here, Edward T. Hall, and he describes it as akin to an unfolding dance. So rhythm has an important role to play in our sense-making. At a very micro level, we know that in humans, we have a natural 1.5-second time limit to anticipating a beat. And that's quite important. If you're autistic, you lie just outside that, and it makes all the difference in the world. Justin London writes about this in his book, Hearing in Time, about beat. Entrainment, something that musicians are increasingly talking about, is a process of mutual co-adaptation, lies below the radar of our conscious self. It's a kind of a rhythmic pull. And we feel it even when we're trying to resist it. So there's a wonderful festival that takes place in the Congado region in Brazil, where different tribal groups get together. And what they do is they move through the capital city, and each tribal group has their beat. And as they come across other tribal groups, they challenge each other to pull towards their beat. Now, the person who wins, obviously, you know, they win and then they move on to the next one, etc. So it's interesting that it's part of their culture to actually explore this. In daily face-to-face communication, we are connected in rhythm and synchrony at multiple levels, ranging from the moment-by-moment continuity of our timed syllables to emergent and body and vocal rhythms of pragmatic sense-making and processes of joining in. So at the Centre for Music and Science, there's work going on about how we can join in. Interesting patterns of, if you're making music together, how does it affect the speech that you then perform? Or vice versa, you're talking about something and then you start playing. It's interesting to see how there's some kind of a relationship between the two. So moving our bodies and voices together in time and body is a pragmatic purpose of being together. Parents will know this, the way they speak to their babies, or even as adults, whenever we come across a small child, we talk to it in a way that we wouldn't talk to an adult. But that's not arbitrary. What we're doing is we're teaching that young infant, that child, how to survive in the culture in which they're going to grow up. It's about synchrony of self with other. And in this synchrony of self with other, witnessing and being present become part of each other. And this idea comes from Caroline Neverhand's work on witness presence that draws attention to the ethical dimension. For example, musicians listen to themselves and each other simultaneously. And this creates a quality of performance that at the same time involves ethical and aesthetic awareness. There's a balance. And we see this in a very good conversation. When you have a really good conversation with somebody, it feels good. It's both aesthetic and it's ethical. In making music with others, we get to know each other at an intimate level. It enables us to hear each other and share our differences at the same time. And it's this quality that brought me to music from my work on looking at collective rhythmic moments in human interaction. I'll show a video clip shortly, but my work on rhythm began with an ethnographic study of how landscape architects come to share a sense of colour as what's pleasing, or a beautiful stroke of a pencil. And I wanted to understand whether the way they move with each other in the space had something to do with this experientially shared aesthetics and its production. And at the time I began this, I was hanging out with some psycholinguists in Japan, a language that I was just beginning to start understanding, and I relied heavily on body movement. And the psycholinguists were developing these kinds of interfaces, multimodal interfaces, where you would literally just have lines on a screen, maybe two eyes, and they're bobbing up and moving around. And all of these sort of facial patterns are moving with the speech. And what they wanted to do was to understand, you know, simple things like, okay, yeah. You know, we all move in interesting ways when we give this kind of feedback. And this kind of feedback is interesting because it's not about the content of words. We are conveying to each other how we are understanding each other. That's what interested me. And I started applying that to how the body does this. So I was looking at landscape architects and seeing how they move and draw together and negotiate and come to acknowledge each other when they're disagreeing. So I began to look at communication as a skill, and a skill in performing with another. Be this to agree, disagree, negotiate, acknowledge, or simply to act at the same moment with another person. So in a 3.5-minute video, there's one significant moment that involves a simultaneous rhythm, and I'm going to show you that shortly. And here you have, let me just see, can I come to this? Yeah, here we are. These are two architects. So on the left here, we have a junior apprentice. He's been with the firm for 1 year. On the right hand, we have the head of the corporation. And this chap on the left, this is a sketch they've been working on as a plan. I'm sorry, it's very, very poor quality. It's been through so many iterations, and I lost tapes and traveling from one country to another. So I have finally this one precious piece which remains. But it's really, really interesting. You have 3 attempts that have been made by the junior architect to be heard about one point in the design. In all the previous attempts he's tried to make this, the senior architect has stood there, not moving, not even nothing, just observing, and ignoring him and talking about something else. Now, in those previous moments, this chap has always been bending down to make his point. Finally, senior architect suddenly moves towards an alternative proposal. It's about how do you get out of the car park? Okay, how do we design this car park and sign it so that people know where could be a main entrance from this car park to the main brewery site? So everything is being redesigned. And it's a simple thing that until then he's been talking about larger ideas about, oh, let's have orange trees or let's have paving patterns. This chap is like, oh, 1 point. This would be a good place to sign an entrance. He now comes forward and he begins to make an alternative proposal. He says, well, let's say you get out of the car here. Then, at that moment, he starts moving down. And it's interesting, as he touches down the paper, this chap goes still. And then they both begin to move together. This chap, finally, in this very, very short period of 1.5 seconds, makes the same proposal he's made 3 times before. This time, they are moving. He is making the alternative proposal. He is making his previous proposal. This chap is now silent. As he moves across, he moves over and acknowledges it with 1 stroke. It's for me a magical moment, and it's what took me to music. I'm going to show it to you. Now, this is the critical thing. Now he comes down, he starts moving, and then he moves back. So it's very, very simple. I'm sorry, I always get very excited about it. It is such a simple thing, but every time I show it, I get excited. So let's get back to this. So let's continue. Yes. So I'd like to briefly mention the work of a very interesting thinker called Polanyi, no longer here. But he wrote a very seminal work called The Tacit Dimension back in the 1960s. Polanyi was reacting to, at that time, Soviet-era focus on rationalism and collective knowledge. And he wanted to look at the individual as a reaction to this and how it is that we know, that he was very deeply interested in the personal. And he describes a relation between emergence and comprehension as existing when an action creates new comprehensive entities. And in a sense, that's what's happening in this moment. So in this movement of bodies moving together, you have 2 people, and they're sharing knowledge of the same comprehensive entity, i.e. their joint skilled human performance. This is not knowledge in a conscious sense. But it's a personal act. And in that moment, you have the performance. You're aware of your own performance, but in that comprehensive entity, you have the performance of the persons and these persons themselves. So again, this is getting away from the notion of an individual and a user. And what binds the example of the architects and music ensembles is the simultaneous listening to oneself and the other expressed at the same time. What I'd like to do is, I'm keeping this quite short. I think I'll go straight to the rest of the Durchgang. Yeah, so this is just. I'm just going to do a few very short clips. One is about when it goes wrong. I think many of us have experienced, you reach out to, you have all these cultural greetings of kisses, and sometimes you just get it wrong. The awkward handshakes, bumping of noses, etc. And, maybe you really like somebody, but somehow you can't quite get your speech coordination quite right. You keep interrupting each other. those are times when I think we become aware of what we take so much for granted, this very fine tuning which we're so skilled at. And at the extreme, it's debilitating if you can't move in time with another human being. So if you have autism or you have depression or schizophrenia, it has an extreme effect. There was a wonderful scholar called Condon, and he worked with people who had autism, schizophrenia and dyslexia, and he was deeply concerned about this business of isolation, and he spoke about the human greeting, and it's a lovely interview on Boston radio. If you can get online and listen to it, it's a real treasure to hear him speak. And he describes how in every culture in the world, wherever you go, you have a human greeting. And that's not arbitrary. The human greeting is a moment of simultaneous rhythmic synchrony. And this enables you to have trust. It buys you time to create the trust. Without the greeting, we would find it very difficult to have communication or to sustain it. I did a lovely little experiment where I got people to separated them in different groups, but got them to sort of try and talk behind a glass door. One set they were allowed to greet, they could shake hands, they could introduce each other, and then they go behind this glass door. The others, no, nothing allowed, have to go straight behind the glass door. The interesting thing is those who were allowed to have some contact found it much easier to begin a conversation. Those who couldn't, it was awkwardness, sort of like, oh, who moves first? An awkwardness to get the conversation going. So the human greeting is very important. And we take it so much for granted, this business of moving together in rhythm, but it's very interesting when you can inhibit it. I had a lovely opportunity where this is taking place in a lab at Stanford, where at the time they only had single touch interfaces. This is how far old this study is. I thought, oh, wonderful, wonderful. That means that you can't touch a surface at the same time. So this is going to obstruct simultaneous rhythm. What else will it obstruct? Because I was convinced there was a system of rhythm. There are moments of synchrony which are more like a feedback model. You would almost like bounce off each other. So that sustains the conversation and buys you the time and builds up towards the moment when you can simultaneously move together. So we have a system in communication. And in this study, I was delighted to see that it obstructed everything. When you obstructed just that one possibility of simultaneous rhythm. That's a moment when they've been having to hold it in. They have learned at the same time. Finally, the chap on the right gets really fed up. You can see his breathing is no longer synchronized. He moves back. Then that movement back and his change in breathing is noticed by the chap on the left, who then says, okay, why don't you go in? He goes in, but the pull, suddenly when they're communicating like this, they're co-adapting. When they're like this, they're not. So the co-adaptation means that when he moves in, he moves with him. He forgets. So that's about mutual adaptation. And you can try out something for yourselves, which is really fun. It's a very simple exercise. We got musicians. Tommy Himberg did this wonderful study where he got pairs of musicians in for 2 minutes each and asked them to tap to a metronome. They tapped to the metronome. They thought, my goodness, what is this? It's so easy. Why are we even being asked to do this? But what actually happened was that they would start tapping to the metronome and then they would tap to each other. They would come back to the metronome and move away from each other, come back to the metronome and move away from each other. So they were moving more to each other than they were to the metronome. So there is something about the human beat that pulls us, that an external beat cannot sustain. And that's also something very interesting to think about when thinking about technology. So, been through that. This is more just some fun stuff for you to think about. If you haven't read his work, Edward T. Hall is a lovely introduction into culture and rhythm, studies around culture and rhythm. He's very, very accessible. And his work is all around experiments. One of them is really lovely. He gets, it's a lovely one which is quoted by various people, but you get an American and a Brit in a room having a conversation. And what they don't realise is that the American moves towards the Brit moves back, the American moves towards the Brit moves back, the American moves, and it carries on like this. But the precision is what's interesting. It's 30-second moves each time. So, you know, there's much that we need to know about ourselves, our cultural backgrounds, I'm interested in this because I've grown up in two cultures. At home, quite traditional Indian. Outside, I was the only Indian girl in an Anglo-Saxon school. So I was always aware that somehow I was a bit of a misfit. And I became very aware of the movement of my voice and my body as making me aware of where things are working and where they are not. I think it's one of the reasons I'm really interested in rhythm. And at a larger scale, something which might be of interest regarding stuff to do with culture and cities is awareness of another human being and their state, their emotional state. So, you know, there's Edward T. Hall makes a wonderful comparison, say, of the Spanish of New Mexico, where they are so constantly aware of what the other is doing. They're always checking in, knowing the emotional state of another person, which means that they can be very, very tuned. It does also mean that because it's so intense, you can have quite a lot of expression of emotion as well. But the Brit, on the other hand, we don't like to interfere. And it means that it may take a bit longer to catch another person before they collapse. So, you know, these are also very interesting things. And I'll end on a little fun thing. This is a play around the human greeting, getting two people to walk into a room from either side. And I was interested to see, will they co-adapt to each other's footfall so that they stop at the same time? It's just a fun little thing. The idea is then that it would become a more complex study on culture and getting people from mixed cultural backgrounds like myself and others, and seeing how we, how just the movement in space is carried in art. And what's nice is one is very tall and one is very short, but they co-adapt. I will leave it at that. Okay. Oh, sorry.
Yeah. Thank you. Satinder Gill, thank you very much.